The carriage wheel snapped in half on a muddy road outside Ludlow, and that single crack changed the direction of a young duke's entire life, before he even understood what was happening. Alaric Vane sat inside that carriage, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, furious at his cousin Julian Ashcombe, who sat across from him grinning like a boy who had just won a hand of cards he had no right to win. They were not lost. They were not in danger. They were simply stuck. And stuck was the perfect word for how Alaric had felt for the better part of a year. "You will not survive it," Julian said, tapping his walking stick against the carriage floor. "A duke, dressed as a servant, taking orders instead of giving them? You would crack within a week." "I do not crack," Alaric said. "Everyone cracks. You have simply never been tested." Alaric looked out the window at the gray fields rolling toward the horizon. His father had died 11 months earlier, and since that day, every room Alaric entered went silent with respect. Every servant bowed a fraction lower. Every young woman at every ball looked at him like he was a prize to be won, rather than a man to be known. He was 26 years old, and he could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him without calculating what his title could do for them. "Name your wager," Alaric said quietly. Julian's grin widened. "1 season. You live as a footman, in a household of my choosing. No one may know who you are. If you last the full season, without being discovered, I will hand over the deed to my hunting lodge in Shropshire, which I know you have wanted since we were boys. If you fail, you owe me a favor of my choosing, no questions asked. And if I simply refuse to play along? Then you admit that the great Duke of Ludlow is too frightened to live 1 season as an ordinary man." Alaric said nothing for a long moment. The carriage wheel would be fixed by morning, and by evening he could be home in his enormous quiet house, surrounded by staff who addressed him as "Your Grace" a dozen times before breakfast. Or he could do something reckless, something his father never would have approved of, something that made his chest feel lighter just imagining it. "Choose the household," Alaric said. Julian's eyes lit up in a way that should have worried Alaric more than it did. "The Pembrokes," he said. "Lord Edmund Pembroke has fallen on difficult times. His estate is respectable, but his fortune is thin, and he is desperate enough for capable staff that he will not look twice at a new footman with good references, which I happen to be able to provide for you under a different name." "And the family itself?" "A wife, Lady Margaret, kind but worried sick over money, and a daughter, Eleanor, who has apparently refused 3 respectable proposals and earned quite a reputation for being difficult to please." Something about the word difficult made Alaric's interest sharpen, though he could not have explained why at the time. 3 weeks later, a young man calling himself Aldrich Bennet arrived at Ashwell Manor, the modest but proud country house belonging to the Pembroke family, carrying a small trunk and a letter of reference that named him as a footman of good character from a household in the north. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Whitfield, looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had hired dozens of young men before him. "You have soft hands," she said. Alaric's stomach dropped. He had not considered his hands. A lifetime of holding nothing heavier than a pen or a glass of wine had left them smooth in a way that no honest laborer's hands would ever be. "I was a valet before," he said quickly, drawing on the story Julian had helped him construct. "Mostly indoor work. Pressing linens, polishing silver, that sort of thing." Mrs. Whitfield studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "We need a footman who can also help serve at table and manage errands into the village. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you start tomorrow. Mind you, this house does not pay what the grand estates pay, and we do not tolerate laziness or pride. Lord Pembroke is a fair master, but Lady Pembroke does not forgive sloppy work, and Miss Eleanor notices everything, so do not think you can hide mistakes from her." Alaric filed that name away without realizing how much it would come to matter. Miss Eleanor notices everything. That first night, he was given a small room above the stables, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a chair. The mattress was thin, the blanket rough, and the cold crept in through a gap beneath the door. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to horses shifting in their stalls below, and felt something strange settle over him. For the first time in nearly a year, no one in this house knew his name, his title, or his father's legacy. He was simply Aldrich, a footman with soft hands, and a story that was not quite true. Morning came early. He was roused before dawn by another footman, a cheerful young man named Peter, who seemed to have decided instantly that they would be friends. "New fellow, eh?" Peter said, tossing him a uniform jacket that did not quite fit across the shoulders. "You will want to move quickly around here. Mrs. Whitfield does not like slow feet." Alaric pulled the jacket on, and discovered, almost immediately, that the fabric was rougher than anything he had ever worn, and the boots pinched at his heels, in a way his own custom-made boots never had. He said nothing about any of it. He simply followed Peter down the narrow servants' staircase, into a world he had never seen from this angle before. The kitchen was loud and full of steam and shouting, though none of it was cruel, simply urgent. A cook named Mrs. Aldous barked orders about breakfast trays, while two younger maids hurried between the stove and the long wooden table, arranging toast and eggs and a small pot of jam onto silver trays that would be carried up to the family. "You, new man, carry this up," Mrs. Aldous said, thrusting a tray into Alaric's hands before he had even finished tying his apron. He carried it up the back stairs, following Peter's directions, his arms already beginning to ache from the unfamiliar weight and the unfamiliar posture required to keep a tray perfectly level while climbing stairs he had never climbed before. He had eaten 1,000 breakfasts in his life, without ever once considering how the tray arrived at his elbow, warm and perfectly arranged, as if by magic. It was not magic. It was aching arms and quick feet, and constant, quiet vigilance. And by the time Alaric set the tray down in the small breakfast room, sweat had gathered along his collar, despite the cool morning air. He kept his eyes low, as Peter had instructed, and began to withdraw from the room. But a voice stopped him before he reached the door. "You are new." He turned. A young woman sat at the table, dark hair pinned back simply, a book open beside her plate, rather than the newspaper her father was reading across from her. She was not looking at him with suspicion or dismissal, the way most of the nobility looked at servants. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a puzzle they intend to solve. "Yes, miss," Alaric said, bowing his head slightly. "Aldrich, if it please you." "It does not particularly please or displease me," Eleanor Pembroke said, though there was a faint curve at the corner of her mouth that suggested she found something amusing in her own bluntness. "But you may go. You are hovering." Alaric left the room quickly, his heart beating faster than the brief exchange should have warranted. He told himself it was simply the strangeness of being spoken to so directly, so carelessly, by someone who did not know that fewer than 100 people in England were permitted to address him without a title attached to his name. Over the following days, Alaric learned the rhythms of the house, the way a man learns a foreign language, slowly, and with many mistakes. He learned which door squeaked and needed to be lifted slightly on its hinges to open silently. He learned that Lord Pembroke liked his tea served precisely 11 minutes after the pot was filled, no sooner and no later. He learned that Lady Pembroke worried constantly about the household accounts, and that her worry showed itself in short, tired sighs whenever she thought no one was watching. And he learned, though he tried very hard not to notice it too closely, that Eleanor Pembroke was almost never where the rest of the household expected her to be. She was supposed to be embroidering in the drawing room, and instead she was found in the library, arguing quietly with herself over a passage in a book on natural philosophy. She was supposed to be resting after a long walk, and instead she was in the stables, feeding apples to the horses, and asking the stable hands detailed questions about breeding lines that most young ladies would never think to ask. She was supposed to be charming at dinner parties, and instead she said exactly what she thought, which apparently had cost her 3 marriage proposals already, according to the whispered gossip among the staff. She turned down a viscount, Peter told him one evening, as they polished silver together in the small room off the kitchen reserved for such tasks. A viscount, mind you, wealthy as anything, and she told him, plain as day, that she found his conversation duller than watching paint dry. "That seems unwise," Alaric said carefully, though privately he found himself smiling at the image. "Unwise is one word for it," Peter said, shaking his head. "Lord Pembroke about had a fit. The family's fortune is not what it once was, you understand, and a match like that would have solved a great many problems. But Miss Eleanor says she would rather be poor and honest than rich and bored." Alaric turned this thought over in his mind, long after Peter had gone to bed. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by young women who calculated every word before speaking it, who measured their smiles to match his rank, who agreed with whatever he said simply because he was the one saying it. He had never once met a woman who valued honesty over comfort, who would rather struggle with dignity than prosper with dullness. He told himself this observation meant nothing. He was Aldrich the Footman for one season only, and then he would return to being the Duke of Ludlow, and Eleanor Pembroke would remain exactly what she was now, a clever and stubborn young woman in a household he happened to be serving. But he found himself watching for her anyway. He found himself listening for her footsteps on the stairs, learning to recognize the particular quickness of her stride compared to her mother's slower, more measured steps. He found himself, without quite admitting it to himself, hoping each morning that he would be the one sent to carry her breakfast tray, simply for the chance that she might look up from her book and speak to him again, however briefly, however carelessly. 2 weeks into his service, an incident occurred that would mark the true beginning of everything that followed. Eleanor was crossing the entrance hall with an armful of letters, hurrying toward her father's study to deliver correspondence that had arrived from London, when her foot caught on the edge of the carpet runner. The letters flew from her arms in every direction, scattering across the polished floor. Alaric, who had been standing near the front door polishing the brass handle, moved without thinking. He caught 2 letters out of the air before they touched the ground and gathered the rest from the floor within seconds, arranging them into a neat stack and holding them out to her with both hands, exactly as any well-trained footman should. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and then stopped, looking at him properly, for perhaps the first time since his arrival. Most servants, when thanked, murmured something brief and looked away immediately, eager to disappear back into the invisible role expected of them. Alaric, without meaning to, held her gaze a fraction too long, the habit of a lifetime spent as a man whose eyes were never expected to lower for anyone. Something flickered across her face, quick and curious, gone before he could name it. "You move quickly," she said. "I try to be useful, miss," he said, lowering his eyes properly this time, though the moment had already happened and could not be undone. "Useful," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Most footmen simply try to be invisible." "Perhaps I am not very good at my job yet," Alaric said, and immediately wondered why he had said something so close to honest, so far from the careful blandness a servant was meant to offer. To his surprise, Eleanor laughed, a short, genuine sound that seemed to escape before she could stop it. "Perhaps you are not," she agreed. "But I find I do not mind it." She took her letters and continued on toward her father's study, leaving Alaric standing in the entrance hall, with his heart beating strangely fast, and a small, dangerous warmth spreading through his chest that he did not yet have a name for, though he would come to understand it very well before the season was over. That night, lying in his narrow bed above the stables, Alaric found himself thinking not of his estates, not of the wager with Julian, not even of the discomfort of his rough uniform, or the ache in his shoulders from a full day's labor. He found himself thinking of the particular way Eleanor Pembroke's laugh had sounded, unguarded and real, and wondering when he might hear it again. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself, as he drifted toward sleep, that a duke playing at being a footman for one season was a temporary amusement, nothing more, and that whatever curiosity he felt toward the sharp-tongued young woman of the house would fade once the wager was won and his ordinary life resumed. He was wrong about this, though it would take him many more weeks to understand exactly how wrong, and by then, the wager would be the least important thing at stake. The days settled into a pattern that Alaric might have once considered beneath him, but now found strangely satisfying. He rose before the sun, dressed in the rough wool of his uniform, and moved through his duties with a growing competence that surprised even himself. He learned to carry trays without spilling a drop, to polish silver until it gleamed, to stand perfectly still and silent for hours during long dinners, while pretending not to hear every word spoken at the table. He also learned, gradually and against his own better judgment, to look forward to the small moments when his path crossed with Eleanor's. She never treated him as the other young ladies of his acquaintance had once treated servants, with a kind of polite blindness that saw the uniform and never the man wearing it. She asked him questions, small ones at first, about whether he had grown up in the countryside or the city, whether he had always worked in service, what he thought of the weather turning colder. He answered carefully, drawing on the false history Julian had constructed for him, though he found himself weaving in true fragments of his own thoughts and opinions whenever he judged it safe to do so. It was on a quiet afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into his service, that Mrs. Whitfield called him into the small sitting room where she kept the household accounts, and informed him that Lord Pembroke required a footman to accompany Miss Eleanor into the village the following morning, as her usual escort had taken ill. "Mind your manners," Mrs. Whitfield warned him. "Miss Eleanor is more independent than most young ladies, and she does not always wait for her escort before wandering off toward the bookshop or the stationer's, so keep her in sight at all times." Alaric agreed readily, perhaps too readily, judging by the brief, curious look Mrs. Whitfield gave him before dismissing him for the evening. The following morning was cool and bright, the kind of clear autumn day that made the village high street look almost like a painting, with golden leaves scattered across the cobblestones and a light mist still clinging to the fields beyond the last row of shops. Eleanor walked quickly, as she always did, and Alaric found himself half a step behind her, carrying a small basket for whatever purchases she intended to make. "You need not walk so far behind," she said without turning around. "I am not accustomed to being trailed like a prisoner under guard." "Mrs. Whitfield instructed me to keep you in sight at all times, miss," Alaric said. "Then walk beside me, and you will keep me in sight perfectly well," Eleanor said, slowing her pace slightly until he drew level with her. They walked together in silence for a moment, and Alaric found himself acutely aware of how close she was, how the morning light caught the loose strands of her dark hair, how her expression seemed thoughtful rather than idle as she looked toward the shops ahead. "May I ask you something, Aldrich?" she said finally. "Of course, miss. Do you find your position agreeable?" The question surprised him enough that he nearly stumbled over his answer. No lady of his acquaintance, in his entire life as a duke, had ever asked such a question of a servant, as though the servant's opinion of his own circumstances might genuinely matter. "I find it different than what I expected," he said carefully, which was, in its own strange way, entirely true. "Different how?" "I had thought service would be simply a matter of following orders," he said. "I did not expect it to require so much thought, so much attention to small details that most people never notice." Eleanor considered this for a moment. "I think most people go through life without noticing very much at all," she said. "They see what they expect to see, and nothing more. I have always found that a great waste." "And what do you notice, miss, that others do not?" She glanced sideways at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "That is a very forward question for a footman to ask." "My apologies," Alaric said quickly, though he did not entirely feel sorry. "I did not say I minded it," Eleanor replied. "I notice, for example, that you do not speak the way most footmen speak. You choose your words too carefully. Either you were raised by an unusually thoughtful family, or you are not entirely what you present yourself to be." Alaric's heart stopped for a fraction of a second, before resuming at a much faster pace. He kept his expression carefully neutral, drawing on every ounce of composure a lifetime of formal gatherings had taught him. "I do not know what you mean, miss," he said. Eleanor studied him a moment longer, and then, to his relief, she let the matter drop, though the faint, knowing curve of her smile suggested she had not entirely believed his denial, and had simply decided, for reasons of her own, not to press further. They continued their walk through the village, stopping at the stationer's where Eleanor purchased a small stack of paper and a new bottle of ink, and then at the bookshop, where she spent nearly 20 minutes debating between 2 volumes, before finally selecting both, insisting she could not choose between them, and would simply have to read both at once. It was as they left the bookshop that Alaric first noticed the carriage. It was a fine carriage, far too fine for the modest village street, with a crest painted on its door that Alaric recognized instantly, though he prayed silently that no one else would. It belonged to a family whose estate bordered his own in the north, a family he had dined with a dozen times as the Duke of Ludlow. He turned his face away quickly, angling his body so that the brim of his cap shielded his features, and murmured something about needing to check on the basket, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, noticing his sudden tension. "Nothing, miss," he said. "Simply the cold." She looked at him a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, but the carriage rolled past without stopping, its occupants apparently having no reason to glance twice at a footman standing beside a young lady outside a village bookshop. Alaric allowed himself to breathe again, only once the carriage had turned the corner and disappeared from view. It was a small moment, easily forgotten by anyone who had not been paying close attention. But Eleanor Pembroke, as Alaric was beginning to understand, paid very close attention indeed, and she filed the moment away in her memory, exactly as she filed away every small inconsistency she noticed in the world around her, waiting patiently for the day when all the pieces might finally fit together. They returned to Ashwell Manor as the afternoon light began to soften, and Alaric spent the rest of the day performing his duties with unusual care, as though sheer competence might somehow erase the danger of the moment outside the bookshop. That evening, as he ate his simple supper in the servants' hall alongside Peter and the other staff, he found himself unable to fully enjoy the easy camaraderie of the table, his mind circling back again and again to the strange, searching way Eleanor had looked at him. He told himself the wager remained unbroken. No one had recognized him. His secret remained safe, but he understood, with a clarity that troubled him more than he wanted to admit, that Eleanor Pembroke was not a woman who missed such details for long, and that whatever careful disguise he had constructed for himself would eventually have to withstand the full weight of her attention, whether he was ready for it or not. Lying awake that night, listening to the wind moving through the stable rafters below his small room, Alaric found himself thinking not of the risk of discovery, not of Julian's wager, not even of the enormous distance between his true rank and the uniform he now wore each day. He found himself thinking of the way Eleanor had slowed her steps to walk beside him rather than ahead of him, the way she had asked after his opinions as though they carried genuine weight, the way her laugh had sounded entirely unguarded in the moment before she caught herself. He realized slowly, and with a growing sense of unease, beginning to care what she thought of him, not as a footman playing a temporary role, but as himself, whoever that truly was beneath the layers of title and disguise he had worn for so long that he had nearly forgotten the difference. It was a dangerous realization to have, and he knew it even as it settled into his chest and refused to leave. The season had only just begun, and already the wager that had once seemed like a simple escape from the burdens of his title was beginning to feel like something far more complicated, something that might cost him more than a hunting lodge in Shropshire if he was not careful. But as he finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, Alaric could not quite make himself regret it. The weeks following the incident outside the bookshop settled into a strange new rhythm at Ashwell Manor, one where Alaric found himself constantly aware of Eleanor Pembroke's presence, even when they were nowhere near each other. He would be polishing silver in the small back room and catch himself listening for her footsteps in the hallway above. He would be carrying firewood across the courtyard and find his eyes drifting toward the library window, where a lamp often burned late into the evening, long after the rest of the household had gone quiet. He told himself repeatedly that this was foolishness, that a duke playing at servitude for a single season had no business allowing his thoughts to circle so persistently around one sharp-tongued young woman, however clever or however unlike the calculating young ladies of his own circle she happened to be. But telling himself this did nothing to slow the small leap his heart gave whenever he heard her voice from another room, or the warmth that spread through his chest whenever she addressed him directly, rather than simply issuing an instruction and moving on. Peter noticed it first, in the easy, teasing way that young men who share cramped quarters and long working hours often notice such things about each other. "You have gone soft in the head," Peter announced one evening, as they sat mending a torn curtain that had been assigned to them by Mrs. Whitfield, with stern instructions to have it finished by morning. "I have watched you drop 2 trays this week alone, and you never used to drop anything. What has gotten into you?" "Nothing has gotten into me," Alaric said, though the heat rising in his face suggested otherwise. "It is Miss Eleanor, is it not?" Peter said, grinning in the knowing way of someone who considered himself far too clever to be denied. "I have seen the way you watch for her. Do not bother lying to me. I have worked in this house long enough to recognize the signs." "There are no signs to recognize," Alaric said firmly, though he kept his eyes fixed on the needle in his hand rather than meeting Peter's gaze. "If you say so," Peter said, clearly unconvinced but willing, for the moment, to let the matter rest. Though I will tell you plainly, as a friend, that Miss Eleanor is not the sort of young lady a footman ought to set his sights on, whatever admirable qualities she possesses. Her family may have fallen on hard times, but she remains a gentleman's daughter, and you and I remain what we are." Alaric said nothing in response, though Peter's words settled uncomfortably in his chest, a reminder of the deception he carried and the impossible gulf that supposedly separated a footman from a gentleman's daughter, a gulf that existed only because Alaric had chosen, for reasons he was only beginning to fully understand, to hide the truth of his own position. The following morning brought an unexpected task that would deepen the strange connection growing between Alaric and Eleanor, whether either of them fully wished it or not. Lord Pembroke, occupied with matters of business in his study, requested that a footman assist Miss Eleanor in cataloguing the contents of the estate's small library, which had fallen into disorganized disarray over the years and badly needed sorting, before a visiting scholar arrived the following month to examine several rare volumes said to have belonged to Eleanor's late grandfather. Mrs. Whitfield assigned the task to Alaric without hesitation, apparently satisfied by his careful, attentive manner that he could be trusted not to damage anything valuable. The library at Ashwell Manor was smaller than the grand libraries Alaric had grown accustomed to in his own estates, but it possessed a warmth and character that many larger collections lacked. Tall windows let in soft morning light that fell across shelves crowded with volumes of every size and subject, from weighty histories to slim collections of poetry, all of it arranged with no apparent logic whatsoever, as though several generations of Pembrokes had simply pushed books onto whatever shelf happened to be nearest at the time. Eleanor stood in the center of the room when Alaric arrived, a long list already in hand, her sleeves pushed up slightly, as though she had already been at work for some time.
"Ah, good," she said, glancing up. "I was told a footman would be sent to assist. I did not expect it would be you, though I confess, I am not entirely displeased."
"I am happy to be of use, miss," Alaric said, bowing his head slightly, before setting to work on the section of shelves she indicated. They worked largely in silence for the first hour, Eleanor calling out titles and authors, while Alaric located the corresponding volumes and arranged them, according to her careful system. But as the morning wore on, the silence between them gradually gave way to conversation, first about the books themselves, then about the ideas contained within them, and finally about matters far more personal than either of them had likely intended to discuss. "You know a great deal about history," Eleanor observed, watching as Alaric corrected her on a minor detail regarding a volume concerning the reign of a distant king. "I read a great deal, when time permits," Alaric said carefully. "That is an unusual habit for a footman. Is reading forbidden to footmen, then?" Eleanor laughed, the same unguarded sound he had heard weeks earlier in the entrance hall, and something in Alaric's chest loosened at the sound of it. "Not forbidden," she said, "simply unusual. Most of the servants I have known have little time or inclination for books, given the demands of their work. Perhaps I simply make time," Alaric said. "There is a great deal of quiet in the evenings, once the household has settled." "And what do you read, in these quiet evenings?" Alaric hesitated, aware that whatever answer he gave would either deepen the disguise he had constructed or begin to unravel it, thread by careful thread. "History, mostly," he said finally. "And philosophy, when I can find volumes that interest me. I find I have little patience for novels." "Little patience for novels," Eleanor repeated, arching an eyebrow. "That is a very particular opinion for a man who claims not to read very much." Alaric realized, too late, that he had revealed more of himself than he had intended, and he searched quickly for a way to soften the admission. "I did not say I do not read much," he said, "only that I have little time. What time I have, I prefer to spend on matters of substance rather than invented stories." "And you consider philosophy a matter of substance, but stories invented, are they not?" Eleanor set down the book she had been holding, and regarded him with an expression Alaric could not quite interpret, somewhere between amusement and genuine curiosity. "I find that invented stories often reveal more truth about the world than the driest history ever could," she said. "A good story shows you how people actually think and feel and struggle, rather than simply reciting what they did and when they did it. But perhaps that is simply my own preference showing through." "Perhaps," Alaric said, and found himself smiling. an expression he quickly tried to suppress, remembering his place, though Eleanor had already noticed and did not seem inclined to look away. They continued their work through the remainder of the morning, and the conversation drifted easily from books to the surrounding countryside, from the countryside to Eleanor's opinions on the management of the estate, opinions she offered with a confidence that Alaric found himself admiring, rather than finding presumptuous, as many gentlemen of his acquaintance certainly would have. "You believe the tenant farms could be managed more efficiently," Alaric said, genuinely curious now, all pretense of careful Footman reticence beginning to slip away without his fully noticing. "I believe a great many things could be managed more efficiently, if anyone bothered to ask the people actually doing the work, rather than simply issuing instructions from a comfortable study," Eleanor said, a hint of frustration entering her voice. "My father means well, but he inherited certain habits of thinking from his own father, and he is not always willing to consider that the old ways may no longer serve us as well as they once did." "That is a bold opinion for a young lady to hold," Alaric said. "Is it bold, or is it simply honest?" Eleanor challenged. "I have spent my entire life being told that a young lady's opinions on estate management, on politics, on anything beyond needlework and pleasant conversation, are unwelcome and unbecoming. I have decided I no longer particularly care whether my opinions are welcome. I would rather be honest and unwelcome than pleasant and silent." Alaric found himself struck, not for the first time, by how thoroughly Eleanor's words echoed the very frustrations he himself had felt for the past year, trapped within the rigid expectations of his title, surrounded by people who valued his rank far more than any honest word he might offer. He understood, in that moment, exactly why she had refused 3 respectable proposals, and exactly why the gossip among the staff painted her as difficult, rather than recognizing what he now saw clearly as simple, uncompromising honesty. "I do not think your honesty is unbecoming, miss," he said quietly. "I think it is rare, and I think it is valuable, and I think anyone who tells you otherwise has simply never learned to appreciate it properly." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her expression, and for the first time since his arrival at Ashwell Manor, Alaric wondered whether she saw him not simply as an unusually well-spoken footman, but as something closer to an equal, a person whose thoughts genuinely mattered to her, rather than a convenient audience for opinions she could not share elsewhere. "Thank you, Aldrich," she said finally, her voice softer than he had heard it before. "That is a kinder thing to say than I expected." "I only speak the truth as I see it, miss," Alaric said, and meant it more fully than she could possibly have understood. They finished cataloging the library shelves as the afternoon light began to lengthen across the floor, and Eleanor thanked him properly before dismissing him to his other duties, though the warmth in her voice lingered with him long after he had left the room. That evening, as Alaric lay in his narrow bed above the stables, he found himself turning the day's conversation over and over in his mind, examining it from every angle, the way he might once have examined a difficult decision regarding his estates. He had come to Ashwell Manor seeking an escape from the emptiness of his title, a temporary adventure, to prove something to his cousin, and, perhaps, to himself. He had not expected to find, in a modest country library surrounded by disorganized shelves, a conversation that felt more honest and more meaningful than any he had shared with another person in years. He told himself, as he had told himself many times already, that this growing fondness for Eleanor Pembroke was dangerous, that it complicated a wager that should have remained simple, that it risked exposing a secret that could bring embarrassment upon his family name if discovered under the wrong circumstances. But he found, increasingly, that these warnings carried less weight each time he repeated them to himself, drowned out by the memory of Eleanor's laugh, the sharpness of her opinions, the unexpected kindness in her voice when she had thanked him. Over the following days, Alaric noticed a subtle shift in the way Eleanor treated him, a warmth that had not been present in their earlier, more formal exchanges. She sought him out more frequently, finding small reasons to request his assistance that seemed, upon reflection, entirely unnecessary, given the number of other servants available to perform the same tasks. She asked him to carry messages to the village that any footman could have delivered. She requested his help selecting books from the library that she surely could have selected herself. She lingered in doorways a moment longer than strictly necessary whenever their paths crossed, as though reluctant to end whatever brief exchange had passed between them. Alaric, for his part, found himself equally reluctant to end these small moments, and equally guilty of manufacturing reasons to be near her whenever the opportunity presented itself. He volunteered for tasks that would take him near the library or the garden, the two places Eleanor seemed to favor most. He found himself lingering over his duties whenever she was nearby, drawing out simple tasks longer than necessary simply to remain within the same room as her a little longer. Mrs. Whitfield, sharp-eyed as ever, began to regard him with a faint suspicion that Alaric did his best to ignore, though he understood the risk he was taking, with every lingering glance, every unnecessary conversation, every small kindness he extended toward Eleanor that exceeded what a footman might reasonably offer his master's daughter. It was during this period of growing, dangerous closeness that Alaric first began to understand the true weight of the deception he carried. He had entered Ashwell Manor believing his greatest risk lay in discovery, in some chance encounter with an acquaintance who might recognize the Duke of Ludlow beneath his footman's uniform. He had not considered, when he agreed to Julian's wager, that his greatest risk might instead be his own heart, growing attached to a woman he could not honestly court while wearing the disguise he had chosen, a woman who believed him to be someone entirely different from who he truly was. He lay awake many nights turning this problem over in his mind, searching for some solution that would allow him to remain honest with Eleanor, without revealing the full truth of his identity, some middle path that might let him keep the growing warmth between them, without risking the catastrophic unraveling that full honesty would surely bring. He found no such path, no matter how many nights he spent searching for one, and he began to understand, with a growing sense of dread, that eventually he would have to choose between the wager and the woman, between the disguise he had constructed and the honesty he had come to value so highly in her company. But the season was still young, and Alaric told himself, with the particular stubbornness of a man unwilling to face an uncomfortable truth before he absolutely must, that he had time yet to find his answer. He did not yet understand how quickly that time would run out, nor how the very qualities he had come to admire most in Eleanor, her honesty, her sharp opinions, her refusal to soften her words for anyone's comfort, would eventually deliver a blow that would shake him more thoroughly than any discovery ever could. For now, he allowed himself simply to enjoy the warmth of her company, the easy conversations that stretched longer each time they spoke, and the growing, undeniable sense that whatever he had come to Ashwell Manor seeking, he had found something far more valuable and far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The garden at Ashwell Manor was not grand, not compared to the sprawling formal gardens Alaric maintained at his own estate, with their precise hedges and imported statuary meant to impress visiting dignitaries. It was smaller, wilder in places, with roses climbing an old stone wall, and a stretch of lawn that sloped gently down toward a small pond where ducks gathered each morning. Alaric had come to think of it, in the weeks since his arrival, as the most honest part of the entire estate, unpolished and unpretentious, in a way that suited its owners far better than any grand design ever could. It was in this garden, on a cool evening in late autumn, that Alaric found Eleanor sitting alone on a stone bench, a lantern set beside her casting soft light across the pages of the book open in her lap. He had been sent to check that the garden gate had been properly secured for the night, a small task that should have taken no more than a few minutes, and he might have completed it quickly and returned to his quarters without incident, had he not caught sight of her sitting there, entirely alone, her expression thoughtful and slightly troubled in the lantern light. "Miss Eleanor," he said, pausing at a respectful distance, "it grows late for reading outdoors. The air will turn cold soon." She looked up, and something in her expression shifted from distraction to genuine pleasure at the sight of him. I think more clearly out here than indoors," she said. "The house grows crowded with expectations. Out here, there is only the pond and the roses, and neither of them cares what I think or say."
"May I ask what troubles you, miss?"
Eleanor hesitated, then gestured toward the empty space on the bench beside her, an invitation that Alaric understood, immediately broke every rule of propriety that should have existed between a footman and his master's daughter. He hesitated only a moment before accepting, lowering himself onto the bench at a careful distance, close enough to speak comfortably, but far enough to preserve some pretense of appropriate distance. "My father has received a letter," Eleanor said finally, her gaze fixed on the pond rather than on Alaric. "From a family friend, suggesting a suitable match, a viscount, recently returned from abroad, in want of a wife, and possessed of considerable fortune. My father is already composing his reply, full of enthusiasm, though he has not yet spoken to me directly about it." "And you do not wish for such a match?" "I do not know what I wish," Eleanor said, a note of genuine frustration entering her voice. "I know only that I am tired of being discussed, as though I were a piece of property, to be transferred from one household to another, valued only for what advantage the transfer might bring my family. I know that I have refused 3 proposals already, and that each refusal has cost my father some measure of patience with me, and that I cannot continue refusing forever, without eventually being forced into a match I have no say in whatsoever." Alaric listened carefully, aware of the strange position he occupied in this conversation. A duke, disguised as a footman, listening to a young woman voice fears about the very system of arranged matches that governed his own social world as thoroughly as it governed hers. He understood, with a clarity that unsettled him, that he too had spent the past year fending off suggestions from well-meaning relatives about suitable duchesses, young women selected primarily for their fortune or their family connections, rather than any genuine consideration of compatibility. "Do you believe there is no place, in your world, for a match made from genuine affection rather than advantage?" he asked quietly. Eleanor turned to look at him properly then, her expression searching. "I believe such matches exist," she said. "I have simply never been offered one. Every suitor who has approached me has done so with calculations already made, weighing my family's remaining respectability against my personal shortcomings, deciding whether the match serves his interests sufficiently to overlook the fact that I speak my mind too freely and care too little for fashionable conversation." "Perhaps you have simply not yet met the right suitor," Alaric said, and immediately regretted the words, aware of how close they skirted to something he had no right to suggest, given his position and his deception. "Perhaps," Eleanor said softly, and something in the way she said it, the way her eyes lingered on his face, a moment longer than necessary, sent a current of warmth through Alaric's chest that he could neither explain nor deny. They sat together in silence for a long moment, the lantern flickering softly between them, the distant sound of the ducks settling for the night drifting across the still evening air. Alaric was acutely aware of how close she sat, of the particular scent of lavender that clung faintly to her clothing, of the thoughtful crease between her brows as she turned some private thought over in her mind. "May I ask you something, Aldrich?" she said finally. "Of course, miss. Do you believe a woman in my position could ever find happiness in marrying beneath her station, if the match were made from genuine affection, rather than calculation?" The question struck Alaric with unexpected force, and he found himself searching for an answer that would satisfy both the footman he pretended to be and the duke he truly was, aware that whatever he said carried weight far beyond what Eleanor could possibly understand. "I believe," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that happiness, built on honesty and genuine regard, is worth more than any advantage gained through calculation alone. I believe a woman who marries for true affection, whatever the station of the man she chooses, is wealthier in the ways that matter than a woman who marries for fortune and finds herself trapped in a lifetime of polite indifference." Eleanor's expression softened, something warm and unguarded passing across her features that Alaric had not seen before, not even in their earlier conversations in the library. "That is a beautiful thought," she said quietly. "I did not expect such wisdom from a footman." "Perhaps footmen think more than most people give them credit for," Alaric said, and found himself smiling, despite the danger of the conversation, despite the growing awareness that every word exchanged between them drew them closer to a precipice from which there might be no honest return. "Perhaps they do," Eleanor agreed, and reached out, almost without thinking, to touch his hand, where it rested on the stone bench between them. The touch lasted only a moment, brief and light, before she withdrew her hand quickly, as though suddenly remembering herself, remembering the uniform he wore, and the position that supposedly separated them. But the moment had happened, undeniable and electric, and both of them sat in stunned silence afterward, aware that something had shifted irrevocably between them. "I should return indoors," Eleanor said finally, gathering her book and rising from the bench, though her voice carried none of the brisk certainty it usually held. "Of course, miss," Alaric said, rising as well, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. She paused before leaving, turning back to look at him one final time. "Thank you for keeping me company this evening, Aldrich," she said softly. "I find I have grown to value our conversations more than I probably should admit." She left before he could formulate any response, disappearing back toward the house with her lantern casting long shadows across the darkening lawn, leaving Alaric alone in the garden, with his thoughts racing, and his heart in a state of turmoil he had not experienced since he was a much younger man, before the weight of his title had settled so heavily upon him that he had forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself alone, without calculation, without consideration of advantage or family expectation. He returned to his quarters that night in a daze, barely aware of the cold or the late hour, his mind consumed entirely by the memory of Eleanor's hand touching his, brief as the contact had been. He understood, with a growing sense of both wonder and dread, that whatever had begun between them in the library weeks earlier had now deepened into something far more serious, something that could no longer be dismissed as simple curiosity or passing fondness. He was falling in love with Eleanor Pembroke, and she, unless he badly misread every signal she had given him that evening, was beginning to feel something similar toward him, or rather toward Aldrich the footman, a man who did not truly exist, constructed entirely from Alaric's own genuine thoughts and feelings, but wrapped in a false name and a false history that made any honest future between them impossible unless he found the courage to reveal the truth. He lay awake long into the night, turning the problem over from every angle, searching for some path forward that would not end in disaster. If he revealed himself now, admitted that Aldrich the footman was in truth Alaric Vane, the Duke of Ludlow, playing at servitude for a foolish wager, would Eleanor forgive the deception, understanding the genuine affection that had grown despite it? Or would she see only the lie, the months of false pretense, the fundamental dishonesty of a man who had allowed her to speak so openly and so vulnerably to someone she believed to be her equal, when in truth he held a position of power and privilege that dwarfed her own family's diminished fortune entirely? He did not know the answer, and the uncertainty gnawed at him relentlessly as the days passed, each conversation with Eleanor deepening the connection between them, while simultaneously deepening the danger of eventual discovery. He found himself seeking her out more frequently now, no longer bothering to manufacture excuses for their meetings, and she, in turn, seemed equally eager to find reasons to spend time in his company, whether in the library, the garden, or the quiet corners of the house where a footman and a gentleman's daughter might speak freely, without fear of observation. The household staff began to notice, whispered comments passing between the maids and footmen whenever Eleanor requested Alaric's assistance for tasks that clearly required no particular skill or attention. Peter grew increasingly concerned, pulling Alaric aside on several occasions to warn him of the dangers inherent in growing too close to the master's daughter. Warnings that Alaric heard, but could not bring himself to fully heed, caught as he was in the growing gravity of his feelings for Eleanor. Mrs. Whitfield, sharpest of all in her observations, began to watch the pair with an expression of increasing concern, though she said nothing directly, perhaps hoping the matter would resolve itself before requiring her intervention, or perhaps simply waiting for clearer evidence before raising concerns that might prove embarrassing if she was mistaken. But there was no mistake to be made. Alaric and Eleanor had grown closer with each passing week, bound together by conversations that touched on matters of genuine substance, by a shared frustration with the rigid expectations of their respective social positions, and by a growing, undeniable affection that neither of them could fully suppress, however much the circumstances of their supposed positions demanded discretion. It was a dangerous closeness, built on a foundation that Alaric knew could not withstand full scrutiny, and he understood, with each passing day, that the reckoning he had been avoiding since his very first conversation with Eleanor was drawing steadily closer, whether he was ready to face it or not. The letter from the Viscount arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by special courier rather than the ordinary post, a detail that immediately signaled its importance to the entire household. Lord Pembroke read it twice at the breakfast table, his expression shifting from cautious hope to open delight, while Lady Pembroke watched him with an anxious hopefulness that suggested she too understood exactly what such a letter might mean for the family's uncertain fortunes. "Aldous Fenwick has requested permission to call upon us," Lord Pembroke announced, setting the letter down with the careful precision of a man handling something precious. "He wishes to make Eleanor's acquaintance properly, with the intention of pursuing a formal courtship, should she prove agreeable." Alaric, standing near the sideboard where he had been arranging fresh coffee, felt his stomach tighten at the news, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, as any well-trained footman would in such circumstances. He had known, of course, since Eleanor's confession in the garden weeks earlier, that such a proposal was likely coming, but hearing it announced so plainly, so eagerly, by Lord Pembroke himself, made the danger suddenly and uncomfortably real. Eleanor's expression, by contrast, remained carefully composed, though Alaric had come to know her well enough by now to recognize the subtle tightening around her eyes that indicated genuine distress beneath the polite surface. "I see," she said simply. "You will receive him graciously, I trust," Lord Pembroke continued, his tone carrying an edge of warning beneath the enthusiasm. "This is precisely the sort of match your mother and I have hoped for, Eleanor. Viscount Fenwick possesses considerable fortune, a respectable title, and by all accounts, a pleasant enough temperament. I would ask that you approach this opportunity with an open mind, rather than dismissing it prematurely, as you have dismissed previous suitors." "I will receive him graciously, father," Eleanor said, her voice carefully even. "I make no promises beyond that." Lord Pembroke seemed satisfied enough with this response, returning his attention to the letter, and beginning to discuss with Lady Pembroke the practical arrangements necessary for such an important visit, while Eleanor sat in silence, her breakfast largely untouched, her gaze occasionally drifting toward Alaric, with an expression he could not quite decipher, though he imagined it carried some measure of the same distress he himself felt at the prospect of this new, formidable rival for her affections. The days leading up to Viscount Fenwick's arrival passed in a flurry of preparation that touched every corner of the household. Mrs. Whitfield oversaw a thorough cleaning of the formal rooms, insisting that every surface gleam and every fabric hang perfectly straight, determined that the diminished Pembroke fortune should not show itself too plainly to such an important visitor. The cook planned an elaborate dinner menu that stretched the household's resources further than usual, while Lady Pembroke fretted continuously over table settings and flower arrangements, determined that nothing should suggest the family's straitened circumstances. Throughout this flurry of activity, Alaric found himself assigned to increasingly close proximity with the preparations, given his demonstrated reliability and attention to detail, a fact that allowed him occasional stolen moments alone with Eleanor, even amid the general chaos of preparation. It was during one such moment, as they worked together arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall for the Viscount's expected arrival, that Eleanor finally voiced the fears she had kept carefully hidden since the letter's arrival. "I do not wish to marry this man," she said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged a spray of late autumn roses. "I have never met him, and already I know, with absolute certainty, that whatever affection he might claim to feel will be calculated entirely around my family's remaining respectability, and whatever small dowry my father can still scrape together." "You do not know that for certain, miss," Alaric said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Do I not?" Eleanor said, a bitter edge entering her voice that Alaric had not heard from her before. "I have seen this pattern 3 times already, Alaric. A man arrives, full of pleasant conversation and practiced compliments, and within a fortnight, I understand precisely what calculation lies beneath his interest. I do not doubt Viscount Fenwick will prove any different, however impressive his fortune or his title." "And if he did prove different," Alaric asked carefully, "if his interest proved genuine, rather than calculated?" Eleanor set down the roses and turned to look at him fully, her expression searching in a way that made Alaric's chest tighten, with a mixture of hope and dread. "I do not think I could accept even a genuine interest from a man I do not love," she said quietly. "I have come to believe, these past weeks, that I would rather remain unmarried and face whatever difficulties that brings than accept a comfortable match without genuine affection." The weight of her words settled over Alaric with a force that nearly took his breath away, understanding as he did the unspoken implication behind them, the suggestion that whatever genuine affection she sought might already be growing in a direction that neither of them had yet dared to name openly. "Your father will not be pleased to hear such sentiments," Alaric said softly. "My father has never had to face the prospect of a lifetime bound to someone he does not love," Eleanor said. "I understand his concerns regarding our family's fortune. Truly I do, and I do not wish to see my parents suffer for my choices. But I cannot make myself believe that a comfortable, loveless match represents true happiness, whatever practical advantages it might bring." Alaric wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a very long time, to reveal himself in that moment, to tell Eleanor plainly that he was not truly Aldrich the Footman, but Alaric Vane, the Duke of Ludlow, a man whose fortune and title far exceeded even Viscount Fenwick's, a man who could offer her both genuine affection and the practical security her family so desperately needed. But the words caught in his throat, weighed down by the knowledge of how such a revelation would land, how deeply it would wound her, to learn that the honest conversations they had shared, the growing trust between them, had all occurred while he wore a fundamental deception that she had no way of detecting. "I am sorry you must face such a difficult choice, miss," he said instead, the words feeling woefully inadequate against the depth of what he truly wished to say. "As am I," Eleanor said softly, and returned her attention to the flowers, though her hands had grown steadier, as though simply voicing her fears aloud to someone who listened without judgment had eased some of the weight she carried. Viscount Fenwick arrived the following afternoon, in a carriage even finer than the one Alaric had glimpsed weeks earlier outside the village bookshop, drawn by 4 matched horses and attended by liveried footmen, whose polished uniforms made Alaric's own rough attire seem shabbier by comparison than it had ever felt before. The Viscount himself proved to be a tall, handsome man of perhaps 30 years, possessed of easy charm and polished manners that Alaric recognized instantly from a lifetime spent among precisely such men in his own social circle. Alaric was assigned to serve at the formal dinner arranged in the Viscount's honor, a position that placed him in the excruciating circumstance of standing silently at the edge of the dining room, while Viscount Fenwick directed a steady stream of practiced compliments toward Eleanor, complimenting her intelligence, her appearance, her conversation, all with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to such performances yielding favorable results. Eleanor, for her part, responded with polite but carefully measured replies, her expression giving away little of the private thoughts Alaric knew she harbored, though he caught her eyes drifting toward him on several occasions throughout the long dinner, brief glances that carried unspoken meaning even amid the formal proceedings. "You have a lovely home, Lord Pembroke," Viscount Fenwick said, addressing Eleanor's father with the easy confidence of a man who had clearly rehearsed such pleasantries many times before. "I understand the estate has been in your family for several generations." "Indeed it has," Lord Pembroke replied, clearly pleased by the Viscount's attention, "though I confess, recent years have proven challenging in maintaining it to the standard my ancestors once achieved. A common difficulty, in these uncertain times," Viscount Fenwick said smoothly, "though I would think such difficulties might be considerably eased through appropriate alliances." The implication hung heavy over the table, and Alaric watched Eleanor's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly, at the blatant calculation revealed so plainly in the Viscount's words, exactly the pattern she had predicted with such weary certainty days earlier. "Indeed," Lord Pembroke said, seemingly oblivious to his daughter's discomfort, entirely focused on the practical advantages such an alliance might bring. The dinner continued for what felt to Alaric like an eternity, each course bringing fresh opportunities for Viscount Fenwick to demonstrate his practiced charm, and each demonstration deepening Alaric's private conviction that Eleanor's assessment of the man had been entirely accurate. Here was a suitor, calculating precisely as she had predicted, weighing the family's remaining respectability against their diminished fortune, offering his considerable resources in exchange for a wife whose intelligence and character mattered to him only insofar as they made the arrangement more comfortable and less embarrassing among his own social circle. By the time the dinner concluded and Viscount Fenwick departed with promises to call again soon, Alaric had grown increasingly certain that he could not simply stand by and watch Eleanor forced into such a calculated, loveless match, whatever the risks to his own carefully maintained disguise. But he understood, too, that any intervention on his part, Any attempt to influence the situation while still wearing the guise of a mere footman would prove not only ineffective but potentially disastrous, drawing exactly the kind of scrutiny that might expose his deception before he had found the courage to reveal it on his own terms. He lay awake that night turning the problem over relentlessly, understanding, with growing clarity, that the wager he had entered so casually months earlier had transformed into something far more consequential than he had ever anticipated, something that now threatened not merely his own comfort or reputation, but the happiness and future of a woman he had come, against every reasonable expectation, to love with a depth and sincerity he had never experienced before. The season, he understood now, was reaching a critical turning point, and whatever path he chose from this point forward would determine not only the outcome of Julian's foolish wager, but the entire course of Eleanor Pembroke's future, and quite possibly his own. The storm arrived without warning, on an afternoon that had begun clear and mild, the kind of sudden autumn tempest that swept across the countryside with little notice, turning blue skies to churning gray within the space of an hour. Alaric had been sent to the stables to check on a mare that had been favoring one leg, and Eleanor, who had gone walking alone despite the household's general disapproval of such unaccompanied excursions, found herself caught halfway home when the first heavy drops began to fall. By the time she reached the stable yard, drenched and breathless, the rain had become a genuine downpour, hammering against the stable roof, with a force that made conversation difficult, without raising one's voice considerably. "Miss Eleanor," Alaric said, hurrying to meet her as she ducked beneath the stable overhang, her hair plastered to her face, and her dress clinging uncomfortably to her shoulders. "You are soaked through. Come inside, quickly, before you catch a chill." He led her into the relative shelter of the stable itself, where the mare he had been tending shifted nervously in her stall at the sudden commotion, and found a woolen blanket, typically reserved for the horses, which he offered to Eleanor with an apologetic expression. "It is not elegant, miss, but it will keep you warmer than standing in wet clothes." Eleanor accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders as she settled onto an overturned crate near the stable entrance, watching the rain continue to pour down in heavy sheets across the yard outside. "I do not think I shall be returning to the house any time soon," she said, a wry note entering her voice, despite her evident discomfort. "No, miss, I do not believe you shall," Alaric agreed, settling onto a second crate, a respectful distance away, though the small confines of the stable made true distance nearly impossible to maintain. They sat together, listening to the storm rage outside, the horses shifting occasionally in their stalls, the rain drumming steadily against the roof above them, and Alaric found himself acutely aware of the strange intimacy of the moment, the two of them sheltered together while the world outside disappeared behind a curtain of gray rain, entirely private and unobserved for perhaps the first time since their acquaintance had begun. "Viscount Fenwick has written again," Eleanor said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "He proposes to call once more next week, with the apparent intention of formalizing his suit before the season's end. And how do you feel about this, miss?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain rather than looking at him directly. "I feel," she said slowly, "as though I am being asked to choose between my family's security and my own happiness, and I do not know how to make peace with either choice." "Perhaps there is a third path," Alaric said carefully, "one that does not require such an impossible choice." "Is there?" Eleanor turned to look at him then, her expression carrying a vulnerability he had rarely seen from her, the sharp confidence she typically wore like armor, softened by the strange privacy of the storm surrounding them. "I have searched for such a path myself, Aldrich, and I confess, I have found none that does not eventually require sacrificing either my family's welfare or my own heart." "What does your heart tell you, miss, if you set aside every practical consideration?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, as though she feared the words might carry consequences beyond what she was prepared to face. "My heart tells me that I do not want Viscount Fenwick, however impressive his fortune or his title," she said. "My heart tells me that I have found, in this house, in these past weeks, a connection I never expected to find, a connection built not on calculation or advantage, but on genuine conversation and genuine regard, and that I would rather face poverty with honesty than comfort with pretense. Alaric's breath caught in his throat, understanding fully the weight of what she was confessing, understanding that the connection she spoke of could only mean the growing bond between them, however impossible, and however dangerous such an admission truly was, given the supposed gulf of position that separated a gentleman's daughter from a mere footman. "Miss Eleanor," he began, uncertain how to proceed, torn between the overwhelming desire to reveal himself fully in this moment and the fear of how such a revelation might land, given everything that had passed between them under false pretenses. "I know how foolish this must sound," Eleanor continued quickly, apparently mistaking his hesitation for discomfort at her admission. "I know that whatever I feel toward you, Aldrich, cannot possibly lead anywhere respectable, given our different positions in the world. I know that my father would never countenance such a connection, and that even if he did, we would face nothing but hardship and social exclusion for the rest of our lives together. But I find, sitting here with you now, that I have come to care for you more deeply than I have ever cared for any of the suitors my family has presented to me, and I could not continue pretending otherwise, whatever the consequences of such honesty might prove to be." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, in a way that Alaric had never heard from Eleanor before, and he understood, with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified him, that the moment had finally arrived when he must choose between continuing the deception that had allowed this connection to grow and revealing the truth that might either destroy everything they had built together or transform it into something far more remarkable than either of them had dared to imagine. "Eleanor," he said softly, using her given name for the first time, a small transgression that seemed to matter enormously in the charged silence of the stable. "There is something I must tell you, something that I fear will change everything between us, but that I can no longer in good conscience continue to hide." Her eyes widened slightly, some instinct clearly warning her that whatever he was about to reveal carried significant weight, though she could not yet have guessed the full magnitude of the truth he was preparing to share. "You are frightening me, Aldrich," she said quietly. "I do not mean to frighten you," Alaric said, gathering his courage, understanding that this moment, this storm-shrouded privacy, might be the safest opportunity he would ever have to reveal himself honestly, without the complications of servants overhearing or family members interrupting. "I only wish to be honest with you, finally and completely, about who I truly am." Before he could continue, however, the stable door swung open with a sudden crash, and Peter burst in, drenched and breathless, clearly having run the entire distance from the house, despite the pouring rain. "Miss Eleanor," Peter said, bowing hastily, despite his obvious urgency, "Lady Pembroke has sent me to find you. She is most anxious about your absence in this weather, and insists you return to the house immediately, storm or no storm. I have brought an umbrella, though I fear it will do little good against rain such as this." Eleanor's expression shifted instantly from the vulnerable openness of moments before to a more composed, careful mask, the sudden interruption clearly reminding her of the propriety she had briefly abandoned in the private intimacy of the stable. "Thank you, Peter," she said, rising from the crate and setting aside the woolen blanket with visible reluctance. "I shall return with you at once. My mother should not be made to worry unnecessarily." She glanced back at Alaric before following Peter out into the rain, her expression carrying an unspoken question, a silent acknowledgement that their conversation remained unfinished, that whatever revelation he had been preparing to share still hung unresolved between them. "We shall speak again soon, Aldrich," she said quietly, before disappearing into the storm alongside Peter, leaving Alaric alone in the stable, with his heart pounding, and his confession left tragically incomplete. He remained there for a long while after they had gone, staring out at the rain still falling steadily across the yard, replaying the conversation in his mind again and again, understanding both the enormous risk and the enormous opportunity that had passed so close within his grasp, before Peter's interruption had snatched it away. Eleanor had confessed her genuine feelings toward him, feelings unclouded by any knowledge of his true identity or fortune, feelings built entirely on the honest connection they had forged through weeks of genuine conversation and shared understanding. He understood now, with absolute certainty, that he could not continue the deception any longer, whatever risks full honesty might bring. Eleanor deserved to know the truth, deserved the chance to decide, with complete knowledge of who he truly was, Whether the affection she had confessed could survive the revelation that Aldrich the footman was, in fact, Alaric Vane, the Duke of Ludlow, a man whose true position in the world dwarfed even Viscount Fenwick's considerable fortune and title. But even as this resolution settled firmly in his mind, a new and unwelcome anxiety began to take root alongside it. What if the revelation of his deception, however well-intentioned, proved impossible for Eleanor to forgive? What if she saw only the months of dishonesty, the careful construction of a false identity that had allowed him to hear her most private thoughts and fears, while offering nothing genuine of his own true circumstances in return? He did not know the answer, and the uncertainty gnawed at him as he finally left the stable and returned to his own quarters, the storm gradually easing outside as evening approached, though the storm within his own heart showed no signs of similarly abating. Whatever path lay ahead, he understood now that it would require a courage far greater than any he had needed to enter this foolish wager in the first place, a courage to face the possibility of losing everything he had come to value most, simply to offer Eleanor the honesty she so clearly deserved. The days following the storm brought no easy opportunity for Alaric to finish the confession Peter's interruption had so abruptly cut short. Viscount Fenwick's promised return visit arrived sooner than expected, and the household plunged once more into a flurry of preparation, leaving Alaric and Eleanor with scarcely a private moment between them, each brief encounter watched too closely by servants and family alike to permit the kind of honest conversation their unfinished exchange demanded. Alaric found himself growing increasingly restless with the delay, aware that every day of continued silence deepened the risk that Eleanor might commit herself to Viscount Fenwick before ever learning the truth of who Aldrich truly was. He began searching for some opportunity, however small, to arrange a private meeting where he might finally complete the revelation he had begun in the stable. But Lord Pembroke, sensing perhaps that his daughter's affections required careful management if the Viscount's suit was to succeed, had instructed Mrs. Whitfield to keep Eleanor closely occupied with wedding preparations and social obligations that left little room for solitary walks or quiet library conversations. It was during this period of frustrated waiting that Alaric overheard a conversation that struck him with far greater force than he could have anticipated, a conversation that revealed the true depth of Lord Pembroke's ambitions for his daughter, ambitions that extended well beyond Viscount Fenwick's considerable, but ultimately secondary fortune. He had been sent to deliver a tray of refreshments to Lord Pembroke's study, where the master of the house sat in conversation with an old friend, a gentleman named Mr. Harwick, who occasionally visited from London and brought with him news of the capital's social circles. Alaric entered quietly, as any well-trained footman should, setting the tray down with practiced discretion, and might have withdrawn immediately, had a particular phrase not caught his attention and rooted him momentarily to the spot. "The Duke of Ludlow remains unmarried, you say?" Lord Pembroke was asking, leaning forward in his chair with evident interest. "Quite unmarried," Mr. Harwick confirmed, accepting a glass of brandy from the tray Alaric had just delivered, "and considered, by all accounts, one of the most eligible bachelors currently in England. His estate rivals anything in the north, and his fortune, I am told, exceeds even that of Viscount Fenwick considerably." Alaric's blood ran cold at the mention of his own true title, spoken so casually in a room where he stood disguised as an ordinary servant, and he busied himself arranging the empty glasses on the tray, straining to hear every word that followed, while maintaining the appearance of a footman, entirely uninterested in his master's private conversation. "I have long considered whether such a connection might be possible for Eleanor," Lord Pembroke said thoughtfully, "though I confess, the man has proven remarkably difficult to draw into society since his father's death. He attends few balls, accepts fewer invitations, and by all reports, has grown increasingly reclusive over the past year." "A pity, given the advantages such a match would bring your family," Mr. Harwick observed, "though I understand Viscount Fenwick's suit proceeds well enough in the meantime." "It does," Lord Pembroke agreed, though something in his tone suggested he had not entirely abandoned his more ambitious hopes. "Though I confess, should the opportunity ever arise to introduce Eleanor properly to the Duke of Ludlow, I would not hesitate to encourage such an acquaintance, whatever progress Viscount Fenwick has made in the meantime. A man of the Duke's position could secure our family's fortunes far beyond anything Fenwick's estate could offer, and I have heard nothing to suggest the Duke's character is anything but respectable. whatever his reclusive habits. Alaric withdrew from the study as quickly as propriety allowed, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just overheard. Lord Pembroke, it seemed, harbored ambitions for Eleanor that extended well beyond the Viscount currently courting her. Ambitions that centered on Alaric's own true identity, an identity he had spent weeks carefully concealing from the very household now scheming to secure it as a marital prize. The irony of the situation struck him with a force that was almost dizzying. He had come to Ashwell Manor seeking escape from precisely this kind of calculated marital scheming, weary of being pursued for his title and fortune rather than for himself, and yet here he stood, disguised as a footman, having accidentally discovered that the very family sheltering him harbored ambitions of securing his true identity for their daughter's hand, entirely unaware that the object of their scheming already lived beneath their own roof, wearing borrowed clothes and a false name. He found himself troubled by a new and uncomfortable question in the days that followed this discovery. If Lord Pembroke's ambitions regarding the Duke of Ludlow were genuine, did Eleanor share her father's interest in such a match? Had she, perhaps, heard enough of the Duke's reputation from her father's occasional comments to form her own private opinions about the man, opinions that existed entirely separate from whatever genuine feelings she had developed toward Aldrich the footman? This question troubled him more than he wanted to admit, and he found himself, over the following days, listening more carefully than ever to Eleanor's conversations, searching for some indication of how she truly regarded the absent Duke of Ludlow, a man she had never met, but whose reputation, thanks to her father's occasional remarks, had clearly reached her ears in some form or another. It was during a quiet afternoon in the library, several days after his troubling discovery, that Alaric finally found the opportunity to broach the subject carefully, disguising his genuine curiosity beneath the pretense of idle conversation. "Your father seems to hold considerable respect for the nobility, miss," he observed, as they worked together sorting through a fresh delivery of books that had arrived for the estate's collection. "I could not help overhearing, some days ago, a conversation regarding a duke of some prominence." Eleanor glanced up from the book she had been examining, a faint frown crossing her features. "You mean the Duke of Ludlow, I imagine," she said, her tone carrying a note of weariness that Alaric found difficult to interpret. "My father has mentioned him on several occasions, always with the same calculating enthusiasm he reserves for any gentleman of significant fortune. And what do you think of the man, miss, based on what you have heard?" Eleanor set down her book entirely now, giving the question her full attention, and Alaric felt his heart begin to pound with an anxiety he could not fully explain, some instinct warning him that whatever answer she gave would carry consequences far beyond the simple curiosity he had pretended to express. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that I have heard enough of the Duke of Ludlow to form a rather firm opinion of him, though we have never met, and likely never shall. My father speaks of him as though he were a prize to be won, a fortune and a title wrapped in human form, and every description he offers only confirms my belief that such men, raised from birth to expect the world's admiration simply for existing, grow inevitably vain and cold, incapable of genuine feeling for anyone beyond their own comfort and reputation." She paused, apparently warming to her subject now, entirely unaware of the effect her words were having on the man standing before her, listening with a growing sense of dread that seemed to spread through his chest like ice water. "I have heard he attends few social gatherings," Eleanor continued, "which my father interprets as admirable restraint, but which I interpret as simple arrogance. A man so convinced of his own superiority that he cannot be bothered to mingle with those he considers beneath his notice. I have heard he inherited his title young, following his father's death, and has since grown increasingly withdrawn, which suggests to me a man consumed by his own importance rather than genuinely grieving, hiding behind grand estates and empty formality rather than facing the world honestly." Alaric stood frozen, unable to summon any response, as Eleanor's words continued to land with devastating precision, each observation striking closer to the truth of his own private struggles than she could possibly have understood, given her complete ignorance of his true identity. "If such a man ever presented himself to me, whatever fortune or title he offered," Eleanor said, her voice carrying an edge of genuine conviction now, "I would refuse him without a moment's hesitation. I have no patience for men who believe their birth entitles them to admiration they have done nothing to earn. Men who mistake cold formality for dignity, and genuine human connection for beneath their station. I would rather remain unmarried forever than bind myself to a man so thoroughly convinced of his own vain superiority. The words settled over Alaric like a physical blow, chilling him far more thoroughly than the rain that had soaked through his clothes during the storm days earlier. Here stood the woman he loved, the woman whose genuine affection toward Aldrich the footman he had begun to hope might survive the revelation of his true identity, condemning that very identity in the harshest possible terms, entirely unaware that the man she described so scornfully stood directly before her, listening to every devastating word. He understood, with a clarity that felt like ice settling in his chest, that whatever hope he had harbored of a gentle, understanding reception to his eventual confession had just been shattered entirely. Eleanor did not simply harbor mild reservations about the Duke of Ludlow's reputation, reservations that might soften upon proper introduction and honest explanation. She held a firm, deeply considered conviction that such a man, whoever he truly was beneath his title, was vain, cold, and fundamentally unworthy of her affection. A conviction built from her father's careless descriptions, but held nonetheless with the same fierce certainty she brought to every opinion she formed. "You seem troubled, Aldrich," Eleanor observed, noticing at last the stricken expression he had been unable to fully conceal. "Have I said something to distress you?" "No, miss," Alaric managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant even to his own ears. "I simply had not considered the matter from such a perspective before." Eleanor studied him a moment longer, some flicker of curiosity crossing her features, before returning her attention to the books scattered across the table between them, apparently satisfied by his explanation, entirely unaware of the devastating effect her words had truly produced. Alaric excused himself shortly afterward, claiming some urgent duty elsewhere, and made his way back to his small quarters above the stables, in a state of profound distress that he had not experienced since his father's death nearly a year earlier. He sat alone on his narrow bed, staring at nothing, replaying Eleanor's words again and again in his mind, understanding with growing despair the impossible position in which he now found himself. He could continue the deception, allowing Eleanor to continue believing him nothing more than a footman, preserving whatever affection she held toward Aldrich, while permanently forfeiting any hope of a future built on complete honesty. Or he could reveal himself as promised, risking that the very words she had spoken so scornfully about the Duke of Ludlow would transform, the moment she learned his true identity, into scorn directed at him personally, shattering everything genuine that had grown between them beneath the false pretense of his disguise. He did not know, as he sat alone in the gathering darkness of that evening, which path forward carried the greater risk, but he understood, with absolute certainty, that the wager he had entered so casually months earlier had brought him to a reckoning far more consequential and far more painful than he had ever imagined possible when Julian first proposed it in that broken-down carriage outside Ludlow. For several days following Eleanor's devastating words in the library, Alaric found himself unable to summon the courage to complete the confession he had begun during the storm, paralyzed by the fresh knowledge of exactly how she regarded the man he truly was, however unaware she remained that Aldrich and the Duke of Ludlow existed as one and the same person. He continued his duties mechanically, carrying trays and polishing silver with a hollow diligence that Peter noticed immediately, though his friend's usual teasing gave way to genuine concern as the days wore on. "You have grown quiet," Peter observed one evening as they sat together mending harness leather in the tack room. "Quieter than I have ever seen you. Has something happened between you and Miss Eleanor?" "Nothing has happened," Alaric said, though the lie tasted bitter in his mouth. "I am simply tired." Peter did not press further, though his expression suggested he remained unconvinced, and Alaric was grateful for his friend's restraint, unwilling to explain a situation so complicated that he barely understood it himself, torn as he was between the growing certainty that he must reveal the truth and the paralyzing fear of exactly how that truth would be received. Meanwhile, Viscount Fenwick's courtship of Eleanor continued to advance with the steady confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of rejection. He called upon the household twice more that week, each visit bringing fresh gifts, fresh compliments, and fresh assurances to Lord Pembroke that a formal proposal would soon follow, pending only the appropriate ceremonial delays that propriety demanded before such matters could be properly announced. Eleanor, throughout these visits, maintained the same careful, polite distance she had shown from the very beginning, offering the Viscount nothing beyond what basic courtesy required, though Alaric noticed, with a mixture of relief and continued anxiety, that her eyes still sought him out whenever their paths crossed during these formal occasions, brief glances that carried the same unspoken question she had left hanging between them in the stable weeks earlier. It was during this period of mounting tension that Lord Pembroke announced, with evident excitement, that the family had received an invitation to a grand autumn ball hosted by a prominent family in the county, an event that would draw guests from across the region, including, Lord Pembroke noted with particular satisfaction, several families of considerable rank and fortune whose acquaintance might prove valuable to the Pembroke family's continued social standing. This is precisely the sort of occasion where Eleanor's prospects might expand considerably, Lord Pembroke told Lady Pembroke over dinner, apparently forgetting or simply disregarding the presence of servants who might overhear such calculating discussions. Viscount Fenwick will of course attend, but so too might other gentlemen of equal or greater standing, should fortune favor us. Alaric, standing near the sideboard as he had grown accustomed to doing during family meals, felt a fresh wave of anxiety at this news, understanding immediately the danger such a gathering represented. A grand ball drawing guests from across the county meant a significant risk of encountering someone who might recognize him, whatever precautions he had taken to alter his appearance and manner since arriving at Ashwell Manor. He had managed, through careful avoidance and quick thinking, to escape recognition during the incident outside the village bookshop weeks earlier, but a crowded ballroom, filled with precisely the sort of society he had spent his entire adult life moving within, presented a far greater and more sustained risk. He considered, briefly, whether he might avoid attendance at the event entirely, feigning illness or some other convenient excuse. But such an absence would likely draw unwanted attention from Mrs. Whitfield, who had already begun watching him with increasing suspicion, given his obvious closeness to Eleanor. He resolved, therefore, to attend as required, taking whatever precautions he could to minimize the risk of discovery, while privately understanding that the danger he had managed to avoid for weeks now approached with an inevitability he could no longer postpone indefinitely. The night of the ball arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn evening that seemed to promise excitement despite the anxiety churning within Alaric's chest as the household prepared for departure. He was assigned, along with several other footmen from the estate, to attend the family throughout the evening, managing coats and carriages and the countless small tasks required to ensure the Pembroke family's comfort amid the grand occasion. The ballroom itself, when they arrived, proved every bit as grand and crowded as Alaric had feared, filled with precisely the sort of glittering society he had spent the past 2 months carefully avoiding. He kept his head low and his movements efficient, retreating to the servants' areas whenever his duties permitted, watching from the shadows as Eleanor moved through the crowded room in a gown of pale blue silk that made her look, to Alaric's admittedly biased eyes, more radiant than any other woman present. Viscount Fenwick claimed her for several dances early in the evening, his easy confidence on full display as he guided her through the intricate steps with practiced grace, while Eleanor maintained her usual polite composure, offering little in the way of genuine warmth, despite the Viscount's evident satisfaction with the arrangement. It was during a brief lull in his duties, as Alaric stood near a side entrance managing a stack of coats and cloaks belonging to arriving guests, that disaster finally found him. "Ludlow?" a voice said, startled and disbelieving, from somewhere close behind him. "Surely that cannot be you." Alaric froze, his heart plummeting as he recognized the voice belonging to Lord Ashworth, a gentleman whose estate bordered his own in the north, a man he had dined with on numerous occasions throughout the years, a man who now stood staring at him with an expression of complete bewilderment, taking in the rough footman's uniform Alaric wore with obvious confusion. "I beg your pardon, sir," Alaric said quickly, keeping his voice carefully modulated, attempting the same disguised manner he had maintained for the past 2 months. "I believe you are mistaken." "I am certain I am not mistaken," Lord Ashworth said, stepping closer, his expression shifting from confusion to genuine astonishment. "I would know that face anywhere. Whatever costume you have chosen to wear this evening. Alaric Vane, Duke of Ludlow, dressed as a common footman. Whatever prank is this? Several nearby guests had begun to turn at the sound of Lord Ashworth's raised voice, their curiosity piqued by the unusual scene unfolding near the entrance, and Alaric understood, with a sinking dread, that whatever careful disguise he had maintained for 2 months was now rapidly unraveling in front of a room full of witnesses. "Please, sir," Alaric said quietly, abandoning any further pretense given the impossibility of maintaining it. "I would ask that you keep your voice down, for reasons I would be happy to explain privately." But it was already too late. The whispers had begun spreading through the crowded ballroom like fire through dry grass, guest after guest turning to stare at the footman, who apparently bore an uncanny resemblance to, or perhaps was in fact, the reclusive Duke of Ludlow, a man whose absence from society these past months had apparently not gone unnoticed among the very circles who now watched this bizarre scene unfold with undisguised fascination. Alaric caught sight of Eleanor across the room, her expression shifting from polite boredom during her dance with Viscount Fenwick to sharp, sudden attention as the whispers reached her ears, her eyes searching the crowd until they found him standing near the entrance, still dressed in his footman's uniform, surrounded now by a growing circle of curious onlookers. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Alaric watched, with a helpless sense of dread, as understanding began to dawn across Eleanor's features, the pieces of 2 months' worth of small inconsistencies finally beginning to arrange themselves into a picture she could no longer deny. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Eleanor made her way through the crowd, abandoning Viscount Fenwick mid-conversation, without so much as a word of apology, her gaze fixed entirely on Alaric, as she crossed the polished floor, with a determined stride that drew even more attention than Lord Ashworth's earlier outburst had managed. Lord Pembroke, alerted by the sudden commotion, hurried toward the scene as well, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to dawning alarm as he registered the growing circle of guests, whispering about his household's footman and the reclusive Duke of Ludlow in the same astonished breath. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Pembroke demanded, arriving at the small gathering just as Eleanor reached Alaric's side, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of shock, hurt, and something that looked dangerously close to fury. "I believe," Lord Ashworth said, still clearly reveling in the sensation his discovery had caused, "that your footman is not entirely what he appears to be, Pembroke. Unless I am gravely mistaken, and I assure you I am not, this young man is Alaric Vane, Duke of Ludlow, currently engaged in some manner of elaborate disguise that I confess I cannot begin to explain." A stunned silence fell over the immediate gathering, broken only by the distant sounds of the orchestra continuing to play, oblivious to the drama unfolding near the ballroom's edge. Lord Pembroke's face had gone through several rapid transformations, from confusion to disbelief, to something approaching delighted astonishment as the full implications of Lord Ashworth's revelation began to settle in. "The Duke of Ludlow," Lord Pembroke repeated slowly, staring at Alaric with an expression that had shifted entirely from the stern authority of a master addressing an errant servant to something closer to awe, the same calculating hope Alaric had overheard in his study weeks earlier, now blooming fully across his features. "Your Grace, I had no idea. Forgive me, I beg you, for any indignity my household may have inadvertently subjected you to during your stay." "There is no need for apology, Lord Pembroke," Alaric said quietly, understanding now that whatever careful control he had maintained over his own narrative had been entirely wrested from his grasp. "The indignities, such as they were entirely my own choosing." But it was Eleanor's expression, not her father's rapidly shifting delight, that consumed Alaric's attention entirely. She stood before him now, her earlier fury tempered by evident bewilderment, her eyes searching his face, as though seeking some explanation that might make sense of the impossible revelation unfolding around them. "Is this true?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying none of the sharp confidence he had grown to love, replaced instead by something rawer and more vulnerable. "You are truly the Duke of Ludlow?" "Yes," Alaric said simply, understanding that further evasion would serve no purpose now. "I am." Eleanor's face went pale, and Alaric watched, with a helpless ache spreading through his chest, as she began rapidly reassembling every conversation, every moment of shared confidence, every small revelation she had offered him over the past 2 months. All of it now recontextualized by the knowledge that the man she had spoken to as an equal The man to whom she had confessed her genuine feelings during the storm. The man before whom she had condemned the Duke of Ludlow so scornfully in the library, had been that very Duke all along. "You allowed me to speak so freely," she said slowly, her voice growing tighter with each word. "You allowed me to confess my private thoughts, my fears about Viscount Fenwick, my genuine feelings toward you, all while knowing precisely who you truly were, while I remained entirely ignorant of the deception surrounding me." "Eleanor, please," Alaric said, reaching toward her, though she stepped back before he could touch her arm, her expression hardening rapidly now, the vulnerability giving way to something closer to the fury that had first propelled her across the ballroom floor. "And the words I spoke of the Duke of Ludlow," she continued, her voice rising slightly, despite the crowd of onlookers still watching the scene unfold with rapt fascination. "The words I spoke in the library, calling him vain and cold, declaring I would refuse him without hesitation, should he ever present himself to me. You stood there and listened to every word, knowing full well that you were the very man I condemned so thoroughly." Alaric felt the weight of every eye in the ballroom upon them, felt the growing whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples across still water, and understood that whatever chance remained for a private, honest conversation with Eleanor had been stolen entirely by the public nature of this devastating unraveling. "I did not know how to tell you," he said quietly, aware of how inadequate the words sounded, even as he spoke them. "I had tried, during the storm, to reveal myself before Peter's interruption prevented me from finishing. I have wanted, every day since, to find the proper moment to explain everything honestly, but I feared, with good reason it now seems, exactly this reaction." "You feared my reaction," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now with an emotion Alaric could not entirely identify, whether anger or hurt or some painful combination of both. "You feared how I would respond to learning the truth, and so you chose instead to continue deceiving me, day after day, week after week, allowing me to grow closer to a man who did not truly exist, a fiction constructed for the amusement of some wager or scheme I cannot begin to fathom." "It was never amusement," Alaric said, his own voice growing rough with the emotion he could no longer fully suppress. "Whatever began as a foolish wager between myself and my cousin transformed, within weeks of my arrival, into something far more genuine than I ever anticipated. Everything I said to you, Eleanor, every conversation we shared, every opinion I offered, all of it was true. The only falsehood was my name and my position, nothing more." "Nothing more," Eleanor repeated, a bitter edge entering her voice. "You consider your name and your position nothing more than incidental details, Your Grace. You consider the fundamental deception of allowing me to believe you a mere footman, when in truth, you possess a fortune and a title that dwarf even Viscount Fenwick's considerable estate, nothing more than a minor omission?" Lord Pembroke, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm at his daughter's evident distress, apparently mixed with equal parts calculation regarding the extraordinary opportunity now presenting itself, stepped forward with an expression of careful diplomacy. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, "surely we might discuss this matter more privately, away from the curiosity of our fellow guests." "I have no wish to discuss anything further this evening, Father," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. She turned back to Alaric one final time, her expression a complicated mixture of hurt and something that might, beneath the anger, have carried a flicker of the affection she had confessed so openly weeks earlier. "I trusted you, Aldrich, or whoever you truly are. I trusted you with thoughts I have shared with no one else, and you allowed that trust to exist on a foundation of complete falsehood." Before Alaric could formulate any adequate response, Eleanor turned and made her way quickly through the crowd, disappearing toward the entrance where the family's carriage waited, leaving behind a stunned assembly of guests and a duke standing alone in his footman's uniform, his carefully constructed disguise now lying in ruins around him, along with, he feared, any hope of the future he had begun to imagine with the woman he loved. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of awkward explanations and curious stares, as word of the Duke of Ludlow's extraordinary masquerade spread rapidly through the assembled guests, transforming what had begun as a simple autumn ball into the most talked-about scandal the county had witnessed in years. Alaric endured the curious questions and thinly veiled amusement of guests who had known him for years as best he could, his mind entirely occupied by the devastating conversation with Eleanor, by the memory of her stricken expression, as understanding dawned across her features, by the finality of her parting words. He returned to Ashwell Manor that night not as Aldrich the footman, but openly and finally as Alaric Vane, Duke of Ludlow, though the victory of finally shedding his false identity brought him no satisfaction whatsoever, overshadowed entirely by the fear that in revealing his true self, he had irrevocably lost the very connection that had made the deception worth maintaining in the first place. The wager with Julian, he understood now, had been won entirely by accident, his identity discovered not through his own choice, but through the chance intervention of Lord Ashworth's sharp memory. But whatever satisfaction such a victory might once have brought him meant nothing now, weighed against the very real possibility that Eleanor Pembroke, the woman whose honesty and sharp intelligence had captured his heart so thoroughly, might never forgive the deception that had allowed that connection to grow in the first place. 3 days passed following the disastrous revelation at the ball, 3 days during which Alaric remained at a small inn in the nearby village, unwilling to return immediately to his own estate, and equally unwilling to impose his presence upon the Pembroke household, given the circumstances of his departure. He spent those days in a state of restless uncertainty, drafting and discarding letters to Eleanor that never seemed adequate to the enormity of what he needed to say, understanding that whatever words he chose could not possibly undo the hurt his deception had caused. Julian arrived on the second day, having heard of the scandal through channels that apparently moved faster than Alaric could have anticipated, his usual teasing grin notably absent as he took in his cousin's haggard appearance. "I did not intend for the wager to end this way," Julian said quietly, settling into a chair across from Alaric in the modest inn-room. "I proposed it as harmless amusement, never imagining you would grow so entangled with the household in question." "The entanglement is entirely my own doing," Alaric said, his voice weary. "I do not blame you for the wager, Julian. I blame only myself for allowing genuine feelings to develop beneath a foundation of deception, and for lacking the courage to reveal the truth before circumstances forced it upon me." "What will you do now?" Julian asked. "I do not know," Alaric admitted. "I have considered writing to Lord Pembroke, requesting permission to call upon Eleanor properly, to explain myself fully, and beg her forgiveness. But I fear such a request would only compound the offense, given how thoroughly her trust has already been betrayed." It was Lord Pembroke, in the end, who resolved the question for him, arriving at the inn unannounced on the third day, with an expression that suggested considerable internal calculation had preceded his visit. "Your Grace," Lord Pembroke said, once seated in the small parlor Alaric had claimed for his temporary lodgings, "I confess, I find myself uncertain how to proceed, given the unusual circumstances of recent days. I understand my daughter remains considerably distressed by the revelation of your true identity, though I confess, for my own part, I see no reason why such a revelation should prevent a match that would benefit both our families considerably." Alaric felt a flash of something close to anger at the transparent calculation in Lord Pembroke's words, the man apparently more concerned with the advantageous match his daughter's distress had accidentally produced than with Eleanor's genuine feelings on the matter. "With respect, Lord Pembroke," Alaric said carefully, "I do not wish to pursue any match with your daughter, built upon calculation, rather than her genuine consent. I have already caused her considerable hurt through my deception. I will not compound that hurt by pressuring her into an arrangement she does not freely choose." Lord Pembroke's expression flickered with something like surprise at this response, apparently unaccustomed to a suitor, particularly one of Alaric's considerable rank, prioritizing a young lady's genuine feelings over the obvious practical advantages of the match. "That is an unusually principled position, Your Grace," he said slowly. "I would ask, however," Alaric continued, "whether you might grant me the opportunity to speak with Eleanor privately, that I might explain myself fully and allow her to decide, with complete information, whether any forgiveness or continued acquaintance between us remains possible. I ask for nothing more than that opportunity." Lord Pembroke agreed readily enough, and Alaric found himself, the following afternoon, standing once more in the familiar garden at Ashwell Manor, waiting with a churning stomach for Eleanor to appear, uncertain whether she would even agree to see him after everything that had passed between them. She arrived eventually, her expression carefully guarded, her posture stiff, with a formality that felt like a physical wound to Alaric, given how naturally warm and open their conversations had once flowed in this very garden. You wish to speak with me, Your Grace, she said, her voice carrying a coolness that made the formal title sound almost like an accusation. Please, Eleanor, Alaric said quietly. I would ask that you call me Alaric, if you are willing. The name is truer than any title, and I would rather hear it from you than the formal address that reminds us both of everything that has gone wrong between us. Eleanor's expression flickered, some crack appearing briefly in her careful composure, though she said nothing, waiting instead for him to continue. I owe you an explanation, Alaric said, and more than that, I owe you an apology, far more complete than anything I managed to offer at the ball. I entered your household under false pretenses, driven by a foolish wager with my cousin, and a genuine weariness with the emptiness of my own position. A weariness that made the prospect of temporary anonymity feel like freedom rather than deception. I did not anticipate, when I accepted that wager, that I would come to care for anyone within your household, let alone that I would fall in love with the very woman whose father hoped, all along, to secure my true identity for her hand. Eleanor's composure cracked further at this admission, her eyes widening slightly, though she remained silent, apparently waiting to hear the full weight of his explanation before offering any response of her own. Every word I ever spoke to you, Eleanor, every opinion I shared, every moment of genuine connection between us, all of it was true, Alaric continued, his voice growing more urgent now, aware that he might have only this single opportunity to make himself fully understood. I never once pretended affection or interest I did not genuinely feel. The only falsehood was my name and my circumstances, nothing more. I understand now how devastating that falsehood must have felt, given how completely you trusted me with your private thoughts and fears. But I ask you to consider that the man you came to care for during our conversations in the library, in the garden, in the stable during that storm, that man was genuinely myself, stripped of title and expectation, speaking more honestly than I have spoken to anyone in years. And the words I spoke of the Duke of Ludlow, Eleanor said finally, her voice quiet but carrying an edge of genuine pain. I called you vain, Alaric. I called you cold. I declared, quite firmly, that I would refuse you without a moment's hesitation should you ever present yourself to me. How can you possibly reconcile those words with whatever genuine feeling you claim existed between us? I do not ask you to reconcile them, Alaric said softly. I ask only that you understand the man you described that day, vain and cold and consumed by his own importance, was indeed who I had become in the months following my father's death, before I ever arrived at your household. I had grown exactly as you described, hollow and withdrawn, going through the motions of my position, without genuine feeling for anyone or anything. But the man who spent these past 2 months in your company, who learned to carry trays and polish silver, and listened to your opinions with genuine interest, rather than practiced condescension, that man was not vain or cold. That man was who I became again, because of you, because your honesty and your refusal to accept empty formality reminded me what genuine connection could feel like. Eleanor stood silent for a long moment, her expression torn between the hurt she still clearly carried and something softer beginning to emerge beneath it, as though Alaric's words had reached some part of her that remained willing to consider forgiveness, however cautiously. You hurt me terribly, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, not through any single lie, but through the accumulated weight of 2 months spent believing I understood you fully, only to discover that entire portions of your identity remained hidden from me. I know, Alaric said, and I do not ask you to forgive that hurt easily or quickly. I ask only that you consider whether the genuine connection we built together, however flawed its foundation, might be worth preserving, if you are willing to give me the chance to build something new upon a foundation of complete honesty from this point forward. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Alaric held his breath, understanding that whatever she said next would determine not merely the outcome of a foolish wager, but the entire course of his future happiness. I need time, Eleanor said finally, breaking the tense silence that had stretched between them in the garden. I cannot simply set aside the hurt of these past days, because you have offered a thoughtful explanation, however genuine your feelings may have been throughout our acquaintance. I trusted you completely, Alaric, and that trust was built upon a foundation I now understand to have been fundamentally incomplete. I understand, Alaric said quietly, though disappointment settled heavily in his chest at her words, however reasonable he understood them to be. I will not press you for a decision you are not ready to make. I only ask that you know I remain entirely sincere in my feelings toward you, and that I will wait however long you require, without any expectation beyond the hope that you might eventually find it possible to forgive me. He turned to leave, understanding that pressing further would serve no purpose, but Eleanor's voice stopped him before he had taken more than a few steps. Alaric, she said, and something in the way she spoke his true name, softly, and without the coolness that had marked her earlier formal address, gave him a small flicker of hope. Answer me one question honestly, and I will consider carefully whatever you say. Anything, Alaric said, turning back to face her. If I had never discovered your true identity, if Lord Ashworth had never recognized you at that ball, would you have eventually told me the truth yourself, or would you have allowed the deception to continue indefinitely, perhaps even after any eventual marriage between us, always fearing what honesty might cost you? Alaric considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer mattered more than any explanation or apology he had already offered. I had already begun trying to tell you, he said, during the storm, in the stable, before Peter's interruption prevented me from finishing. I had resolved, in the days following that conversation, that I could not continue the deception any longer, whatever the risk to my own comfort or reputation. I cannot prove this claim beyond my own word, given how the truth was ultimately revealed by circumstance rather than my own courage. But I can tell you honestly that I had already chosen to tell you before Lord Ashworth's recognition made the choice for me. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Alaric watched as something in her expression gradually softened, the careful guard she had maintained throughout their conversation beginning, finally, to ease. I believe you, she said quietly. I do not know yet whether I am ready to fully forgive the deception itself, but I believe that you intended honesty, even if circumstance robbed you of the chance to offer it on your own terms. That is more than I hoped for, given everything I have put you through, Alaric said softly. I am not offering forgiveness yet, Eleanor said, though her voice carried none of the coldness it had held earlier. I am offering only the possibility that forgiveness might eventually be possible, if you are willing to earn it through patience and continued honesty, rather than expecting it simply because you have finally spoken the truth. I am entirely willing, Alaric said, hope beginning to bloom cautiously in his chest, for the first time since the disaster at the ball. I will wait as long as necessary, and I will answer any question you ever ask of me, with complete honesty, whatever the answer might cost me. Eleanor allowed a small, uncertain smile to touch her lips, the first genuine warmth Alaric had seen from her since the revelation of his identity had shattered their careful world of shared confidences. Then perhaps, she said, we might begin again, properly this time, with no falsehood standing between us. Over the following months, as autumn gave way to winter and the initial scandal of the Duke of Ludlow's extraordinary masquerade gradually faded from the gossip of county society, Alaric proved true to his word, calling upon Eleanor regularly, with his father's title now openly acknowledged, courting her honestly and patiently, answering every question she posed about his past, his feelings, and his true character, with a completeness he had never before offered anyone. Viscount Fenwick's suit, unsurprisingly, withdrew quietly once the scandal made clear that Eleanor's affections lay firmly elsewhere, and Lord Pembroke, whatever his initial calculating enthusiasm for the match, found himself genuinely surprised by the evident, growing happiness his daughter displayed throughout Alaric's careful, honest courtship, a happiness that seemed to deepen with each passing week, rather than the guarded distance she had maintained toward every previous suitor. Eleanor tested him repeatedly during those months, Alaric understood, though she never stated as much directly. She asked pointed questions about his year of withdrawal following his father's death, about the true nature of his wager with Julian, about whether he had ever, even briefly, considered continuing the deception rather than risking its revelation. He answered each question honestly, however uncomfortable the truth proved, understanding that whatever trust he hoped to rebuild required a foundation far more solid than the comfortable falsehoods that might have made his answers easier to hear. It was in the same garden where their acquaintance had first deepened, nearly 6 months after the disastrous revelation at the autumn ball, that Alaric finally asked Eleanor the question he had been waiting patiently to pose. understanding that the timing must be entirely her own choice, rather than any pressure of his making. "I once heard you say," he reminded her gently, as they sat together on the same stone bench, where she had first confessed her fears about Viscount Fenwick's approaching courtship, "that you would rather remain unmarried forever than bind yourself to a man convinced of his own vain superiority. I have spent these past months attempting to prove myself something other than that man, whatever impression my title once created before you knew me properly. I would ask you now, honestly, and without any expectation of a particular answer, whether you might consider binding yourself instead to the man you came to know as Aldrich, a man who happens also to be the Duke of Ludlow, but who hopes, above all else, to be simply your husband and your equal in honesty, whatever our respective positions might suggest to the wider world." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than immediately responsive, and Alaric waited with his heart pounding, understanding that whatever answer she gave now would carry none of the uncertainty that had clouded their earlier, painful conversations. "I have thought a great deal, these past months, about the man I fell in love with in this very garden," she said finally. "I have come to understand that the honesty I valued so deeply in our conversations, the genuine regard you showed for my opinions, the willingness to listen rather than simply instruct, none of that depended upon whether you wore a footman's uniform or a duke's fine clothing. Those qualities were genuinely yours, Alaric, whatever name you carried at the time." "Does that mean," Alaric said carefully, not daring to hope too much, "that you might consider forgiving the deception itself and building something new with me, honestly, from this point forward?" "It means," Eleanor said, a smile finally breaking fully across her features, the same unguarded warmth he had first heard in her laugh outside the bookshop months earlier, "that I would be a fool to refuse a man who has spent 6 months proving, through patient and consistent honesty, that he is exactly the person I came to love, regardless of whatever title he happens to carry." Their wedding took place the following spring, a quieter affair than county society might have expected given Alaric's considerable rank, held in the same garden where their true acquaintance had first blossomed. Attended by a household staff who had watched the entire remarkable courtship unfold, with a mixture of astonishment and genuine affection for the young footman who had turned out to be a duke, and for the sharp-tongued young lady who had refused 3 respectable suitors before finally finding, in the most unlikely of circumstances, a match built entirely on honesty rather than calculation. Julian attended as well, grinning throughout the ceremony, with the particular satisfaction of a man who understood that his foolish wager, whatever chaos it had briefly caused, had ultimately delivered his cousin something far more valuable than a hunting lodge in Shropshire, a genuine and lasting happiness that Alaric had feared. Following his father's death, he might never find at all. Lord Pembroke, for his part, found himself the beneficiary of precisely the advantageous connection he had once schemed for so calculatingly, though he came, in time, to understand that the genuine happiness his daughter had found mattered far more than any practical advantage the match happened to bring, a lesson that softened his approach to such matters for the remainder of his years. Eleanor and Alaric built their life together on the same foundation that had first drawn them to each other in the library, the garden, and the stable of Ashwell Manor, a foundation of honest conversation, genuine regard for each other's thoughts and opinions, and a shared refusal to accept empty formality in place of authentic connection. Alaric never forgot the words that had once chilled him so thoroughly in that quiet library, the harsh condemnation Eleanor had spoken of a man she believed to be a stranger, and he came to understand, in time, that those very words had ultimately taught him more about himself and about the woman he loved than any comfortable flattery ever could have, forcing him to become, through patient effort and genuine honesty, exactly the man worthy of the love he had so unexpectedly found while wearing another man's name.